Welcome to the podcast, Whiskey and a Map. Stories of adventure and expeditions as told by those who live them. I'm your host, Michael Reinhart. It has been said that many adventures and expeditions start simply with a map and a glass of whiskey, a desire to go and see the world's wild places. You're invited to pull up a chair, pour yourself a glass of your favorite whiskey, and join us as we hear stories from another one of our friends just returned from the field. I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine, Amy Greeson. Amy travels around the world seeking natural remedies and cures in the rainforests and the jungles and the wild places. Amy, how would you describe what you do?
It's a great question, Mike. I think when I look at it, my entire life, studying pharmacy, and then I guess probably the first 8 to 10 years of practicing as a retail pharmacist, I was always under the impression that all the pharmaceuticals we were dispensing came from a bottle, which came from a laboratory that was synthetically created. In the 90s in our area, you guys in California were way far ahead of us, but it was around the 90s in our areas in North Carolina that people really started looking a lot more at herbal treatments. The St. John's wort and ginkgo were just becoming common words, and we had customers that were doing a lot of the herbs and also taking a lot of prescriptions. And so I built a practice with integrative medicine so that I would make sure that what they wanted to do, we were doing it safely, and there were not a lot of drug interactions and so forth. But during that process of really starting to learn about plant medicine, I began to understand how many of our pharmaceuticals actually came from nature. And, roughly 55% of the prescriptions that we were dispensing every single day had their origins in nature, but we never were taught that, or you don't see the commercials where they start telling you about the newest, greatest pharmaceutical, and then said, by the way, this came from the digitalis leaf or so forth. And so I think for me, there was a twofold process. I became more aware of how vital plant medicine is, how important nature is, how critical our indigenous cultures are, because they are really the keepers of this great wisdom. But also, their significance in mainstream pharmacy. At the same time, I guess, I also saw that we were no longer really exploring nature like we used to in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as far as their relevance to pharmaceuticals. And so I wanted to go out and find these treatments, and find is not the right word, maybe become aware of these treatments and work with indigenous people to perhaps bring those on a greater scale so that the rest of the world could benefit by these beautiful treatments. And so that was a long roundabout answer to your question, but thank you for asking that.
Oh, it's quite impressive work. And we're going to get into, I believe, your first forays into the tropical areas, the Amazon, the Andes. But before we let you go there, you got a good drinking story for us.
I do. I actually have a couple. One, and I think the first one that comes to mind, which is a very happy one, was when I was admitted into the Explorers Club. And my friends, Michelle Westmoreland and Dave Dolan and several others said, you got to have a little Shackleton. And so I bought a bottle of Shackleton, and with my dearest friends, we all toasted to that. And that will always be one of my favorite memories because the Explorers Club was actually one of the highlights of my life. And then the other is more of a a difficult memory, but when we were in the Congo, we were in an area that was listed as undocumented. And during the process of being in this first foray into this area, we ran out of water. And we had these satellite images, and it showed creeks, rivers running through, and we anticipated restocking our water every so often when we got to these points, but it was the dry season. And Mike, it's like every time we got to this area, it was nothing but like a dried creek bed. And so it was one of the most difficult things because everyone was severely dehydrated, and you're still carrying, I think I was probably at a 45-pound pack, but our guides and translators and trackers were all carrying, they were much stronger, so 55, 60-pound packs, and carrying those things when you're dehydrated. And so when we finally came out, we're walking along this dirt logging road, and we come across this small creek. And the tendency was just to sort of face plant yourself into this creek and just, drink it all up. But at that point, we had steri pens, and so we treated the water. And although it was brown, and of course, you know what it's like, particles in the water, it didn't matter. But that was one of the most enjoyable drinks I've ever had in my life.
You mentioned that many of our pharmaceuticals that we enjoy, that we benefit from, originated from natural sources in tropical rainforests and jungles. Can you give us some examples so that we can have a feel for what you're out there looking for?
Absolutely. Some of my favorite examples are actually more animals, even though we focus on the plants and such, but there's a fine line between killing and healing, if you will. So, for example, there's a venomous pit viper down in South America called Bothrops terrarica. Researchers, when they were studying this snake, they noticed that when it struck its prey, it caused a life-threatening plunge in blood pressure. So they isolated a compound out of this venom, and it became a drug called captopril. And captopril is in a class of drugs that we call ACE inhibitors. And this is used for people primarily with high blood pressure. And so now there's you can go to any pharmacy anywhere in the United States. You will see large bottles of drugs like captopril, enalapril, lisinopril, and so forth. And that all came from that venomous pit viper. And then, huge amount of our antibiotics, from penicillin, cephalosporin, the AIDS drug, AZT, our number one blood thinner, which most people know by the name of Coumadin or warfarin. The story with that was back in the 1920s. There were farmers in Wisconsin, and some of their cattle were bleeding. They were hemorrhaging to death. And they finally found the source of this to a particular batch of sweet clover. This particular batch had been stored in overly dried conditions, and those conditions had facilitated the development of a mold. And that mold was preventing the blood from clotting. So scientists and researchers looked at this, and they looked at this, and they studied it. They created, I can't remember when, like in the 40s, I guess, brought a product to market, and they used it for rat poisoning. Well, they always thought it was unsafe for human consumption when, several years later, I think it was an Army inductee attempted suicide by taking it, and he lived. So then they created the pharmaceutical, which became Coumadin and later warfarin. And to my knowledge, I believe it's still the world's most prescribed anticoagulant, blood thinner, so forth. So there's just huge amounts of stories with things that, I look at when I was a pharmacist and dispensing these meds. And I'll tell you, Mike, I was dispensing the captopril, the one that came from the venomous pit viper. And I was telling one of our patients one day, I said, "Oh, you're never going to believe where this pharmaceutical came from." And I told her, and I'll be dadgum if she didn't call her doctor and said, "I am not taking a prescription that came from a snake." I sort of stopped telling people where their drugs came from after that.
It's amazing, though. Coumadin from a fungus that's growing on a clover, that's growing somewhere out in the wild places. That was, how they found it and how they were able to develop it is amazing.
It is. And so often when we've been on these treks, I will ask the elders, now, how do you know this medicine? Because, you know how it is, Mike, you're in a jungle and there's millions of species. So how do you know that this one particular plant is good medicine? It won't kill you. So many times the answer was, my father taught me, and his father, and his father, and his father. And there's no real answer as to that initial source. So I think a lot of times they were dreams. Spirit-led is what I've been told as well. Or they have watched an animal, like the puma, eating, bark or something that made himself feel better. I think that was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was an anti-malarial drug that came out of that story. But I think that there is a huge spiritual connection that our Western medicine hasn't quite acknowledged as much as the other cultures in the world. And it's significant when it comes to healing.
And I understand you had an extraordinary experience in Madagascar. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And do
Can
you know
tell us
what?
that story?
Do you know that was the exact story that came to mind when you mentioned that question? So we were in Madagascar, and they have very important spiritual ceremonies, if you will, from Trumbas and Ombiases. And so we traveled all day to an area, spent the night, and then basically traveled all day by boat along the coast of Madagascar to get to this particular area that a friend of our guides had heard about, but no one had actually been there. And so we arrive to this village unannounced. Thankfully, they allow us to come on shore. We asked permission of the elders to speak with their healer. So they granted us this permission, and we are walking through this village, on the outskirts of this village, and are being led to this healer's home. And when we arrive, the healer's not there. He is out tending his rice field. And so we wait and we wait. And the reason I'm saying that or starting with that part is because when the healer arrived, he had no forewarning that we were there. So when he came, he immediately took us into his healing hut, if you will. And we went into ceremony after we spent about an hour talking to him. With this ceremony, with all sacred ceremonies, you're never really allowed to film or audio. It is so sacred that that is just something that you just cannot do. And so for this, the building was so small that only two of us could stay with our translator and the healer. And we sat across the room, the width of this hut, crossing our legs and sitting. Our legs overlapped, our knees overlapped. And that's how small this building was. But the healer started the ceremony. I will tell you, so he closed the door. It's completely dark. It's a wooden shed that is raised about a foot off the ground in the middle of nowhere. There's no other buildings around. About 20 feet beyond it is where the forest basically begins. But it's just cleared all around this one little hut. We all have to be blindfolded. So we're blindfolded. The door is shut. The rest of our team is outside this hut. And we are sitting there, and the healer begins to summon the spirits. He's calling in the spirits. And we sit there, nothing happens. A few minutes later, says the same thing. Our translator, who's sitting to the right of me, says he's calling in the spirits. So he calls them in. A few seconds later, the entire hut shook. A voice came back behind myself and my dear friend Josh, who was with us in the hut. It was one of those sounds, Mike, to this day, I cannot describe what this sound is like other than these movies that are like horror flicks that have these demonic sounds. It was eerie, it was dark, and I could not fathom the entity that this voice was behind. And so I'm sitting there, I'm literally praying, please protect us, because I have no idea what I've gotten us into. I don't know what's going to happen. Josh later on told me he was doing this exact same thing. But this healer begins to have this conversation with this spirit entity. They go through this whole process of helping our translator, who has an issue of someone has been stealing his rice. At this time, food is very scarce. So somebody stealing your rice supply threatens, the food for your entire family. So it was a huge ordeal. But they had this conversation back and forth. And every time the translator says something to the healer, and then he tells us what he's saying, then the entity behind us responds in this language. This goes on for like 20, 30 minutes. And then we end the ceremony. When we walk out, my whole insides are quivering. The team said both of our faces were just like absolutely white. But it took hours to calm down. And it wasn't so much, it was scary. And it was scary because I'd never had an experience with that before. It wasn't scary to anyone in that culture because this is just the norm of what they experience. And so it opened my heart and my mind to understanding the connections that other people have in the world. I began to understand that there was just so much that I don't know, that I don't understand. And so that will always be one of those experiences in life that always make me think twice before I have a judgment on what anybody else practices.
Still have to be scratching your head as to what was it?
I know. Do you know? So afterwards, and then when the ceremony ended, the hut shook again. On the outside, our team is seeing the hut shake. They have no idea what we're doing in there. They just assume we were dancing or doing something like that. But the most amazing thing is they heard us, they heard not us, they heard the translator, and they heard the healer, but they never heard the louder, more boisterous voice of that spirit, even though, it was just wood wind could come through, little light could come through that hut. And you would think that any kind of audio sound would have penetrated out, but they never heard the voice of that, even though that was so much louder than the translator and the healer. And that at that point was just like, all of a sudden your stomach just like tightens and it's like, there's no way you did not hear that. There's just no way. So it was something that took Josh and myself quite a while to get over.
Is it Jahiri?
Yes.
Jahiri, I think you were asking about the spirits and how he knew how to treat people. Did he say that he received information from these spirits on how to treat them?
Yes. And sometimes it was more of a spiritual mental psychological treatment, and sometimes it was through plants. But he also had in his hut, he had an area, it was like an altar area. So, rocks and other sacred objects. But there were also like knives, like Bowie knives. And I had never seen sacred objects like that. And so even when we inquired, what are the knives for? He didn't really elaborate other than to say when people had problems, sometimes they would use that and it would take care of the problem.
I think, if I remember in your book, he described, I think it was a possession, and that a spirit used the knives. And when you start asking, well, how does spirit use the knives? He deferred.
Yeah, that's when I wanted to sort of back up a few feet or so. No, I'm just joking. So I don't know. Those are probably such secrets that are not shared a lot with the outside world.
Yeah, there's that trust and whether or not they'll share it with you. Let me switch gears on you. Your first forays into tropical rainforests and jungles, that I believe occurred in the Amazon basin in the Andes?
Yes.
And what led you there?
I had a friend who was spearheading the movement with natural medicine for pharmacists. She had been studying with a shaman in Peru, I think it was Peru, for many, many years. And he finally allowed her to bring a few of her friends. Spent time with him. He was just an amazing teacher. And being in that jungle was this feeling, and it's still like that it's a piece that my soul connected on so many levels. When it was time to leave and we are, boating out of this area, which we're in dugout canoes, and then there was and I don't want to say it was depression, it was a sadness for leaving that, because I felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind. I think what it is just that part of our human soul that connects to nature. And as a pharmacist, I spend 40, 50, 60 hours of my life every week inside of four walls and had not been reconnecting to nature. And so I think that I just fell in love with nature. And the more I fell in love, the more I learned. And the more I learned, the deeper I fell. And until it was just a part of who I became.
I want to go into a little bit more detail. The healer's name was Miguel?
Yes.
Miguel, how would you describe him?
Wow. He incredibly knowledgeable. Just wise, knowledgeable, patient. And you just immediately, there was an honor and a respect just for being in his presence, even though he didn't speak your language, you didn't speak his, the translators, but it was, hundreds, if not thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom. I realized that I was in the presence of someone that I couldn't even grasp the significance of who he was. But of course, you would never know that because he was so humble.
Can you give us an idea of that depth of knowledge that he had? And did he take you through the rainforest there and show you the various plants and animals?
Yes. We would be walking in areas where he would have a machete and just slicing through, would come to a plant and stop and say, we use this for this, and this is what we do, or the bark of this tree. His knowledge, it was just amazing. And there were times that he would say, this is a good plant, but this one's not ready yet. Or this tree, this is the same as this tree, but this is the one we take the medicine from. visually, there's no difference. They look exactly the same, but he could tell a difference. And I don't know if there was physical signs to that, or if it was more of a spiritual epiphany, or I don't know, but to me, they looked the same. So it was fascinating. And I will tell you that there was a healer, and he was in Papua New Guinea. And I never will forget, we were talking to him, and if memory serves me right, we had double translations because of his dialect. And so it took time for the translation to come through. But he was describing a plant that they used. The translation was saying it was thinning the blood. And I'm like, what do you mean thinning the blood? He got up and he dropped his right arm and made his face sort of, lower. And it was like charades of a stroke. He was, absolutely with charades going through the classic symptoms of a stroke. He was saying that the blood clots, it stops, and that this plant will get the blood to flow again. I'm just mesmerized because, when I'm in pharmacy school, we learned all about this, your clotting factors. And I'm thinking, this gentleman has no education. He's nowhere near a university. There are other people do not come here. How does he know that? And the best that our translator could get was visions he could see in the body that, and you will see that healers will sometimes say that they're worms or that they're insects. If you think about it under a microscope, right? When you look at organisms and stuff, they do look like worms and spiders and things like that. And but this is all through some kind of visions that they are so in tuned. Anyway, it blew me away. I was just like absolutely blown away with that one.
Just to make sure that people aren't under the wrong impression that these areas are comfortable to be in. I mean, these are jungles with humidity approaching 90%, high temperatures, all kinds of crawlies around.
Yeah,
there was one in particular in the Amazon. Tell us about the caterpillar.
Oh, you would bring that one up. My mother and father make me tell this story all the time, and it's so embarrassing, but I'm going to tell it for you. So we are in the jungle. We had been out the whole day and came back to our base camp, if you will. There's constantly insects flying around you all the time. And it's just a normal reaction. You're constantly swatting, not only to keep from getting bitten or stung, but you don't know what those bites and stings will produce. And so that's the scarier part of it, is you don't want to get there and all of a sudden have some kind of health crisis because of that. And so anyway, we were standing around talking, and there was an insect on the back of my leg that just kept bothering me, and I kept swatting without looking at it because we're all engaged in a conversation. And I finally just got so irritated that I hauled off and I just knocked the crap out of the back of my leg, thinking, I'm going to get rid of this little fly for the last time. And when I did, all of a sudden it felt hornet stings in between, the folds of your fingers, which is such delicate skin in there. I mean, I'm doing everything to keep a little tear from dropping out of my eye because it's quite painful. And I look back and there is a spiny caterpillar on the back of my leg. Well, the healer walks away, or our guide does, Miguel does, walks away and comes back, pries this thing off of my leg. But it started to affect me psychologically because I kept thinking, how did this thing get on my leg? And I wasn't even aware of it. And it wasn't a tiny little thing. I'm thinking, God, what else is on my body that I'm not aware of?
It's just not a caterpillar. You eventually found out more about it.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I'm back home, and fast forward 4 or 5 months later, I guess, I am at the bookstore and I see a new book that has just come out. And I buy this because it's on insects and nature and such. And I go home and I'm just absolutely fascinated. And I'm going through, and there's a picture of the spiny caterpillar. And I'm like, oh my God. Well, the book is a book about the most venomous and poisonous creatures. And what intrigued me to buy this book is because so many of those are the beginnings to a lot of the compounds that have become our chemo drugs, our pain meds, things like that. So I'm always intrigued with these very venomous, poisonous entities on Earth. And so anyway, yeah, I start freaking out because I'm reading about it, and it says it can cause delayed hemorrhaging, like in the brain. And, so all this stuff starts going through your mind. And I'm like, oh, I have been forgetful lately. And, am I bleeding out the brain and in my abdomen and all this stuff? And so I sent a note to the doctor, and I'm like, oh, I got a little stung by this about 7 or 8 times several months ago. And they call and send me to the hospital. So I undergo all these tests, and everything is fine. But it does make you realize that even anything as small as a tiny little caterpillar can have detrimental effects.
An experience. To better understand what you're looking for and what is out there, there's 2 concepts, if you could describe for us. The first is, what is the law of signatures?
The law of signatures is basically that in nature, that the great spirit, that God, whatever name you'd like to use, has placed in nature sort of signs that will tell you what it's good for. So, for example, if you see a fruit that looks almost like the brain, you would definitely want to study and make sure that you test that for Alzheimer's or dementias or cognitive issues. A tree, for example, that you cut into it and it has red bark, you might want to think circulation, blood flow, things like that. Leaf or a flower that might look, or a pod that might look like a kidney, you will want to test that for any kind of kidney function, diuretics, anything along that line. And what's amazing is how often I've seen that that's so true. So like in the Congo, we get to this area, huge tree, 18 feet wide and in diameter, maybe 25 feet in diameter. They take the machete, cut into it, and it's a yellow inside. When I asked, what do they use that for? It was urinary tract. So, the yellow, the urine. I just saw that time and time and time again. And then there are things that, for example, if you were in the jungle and you see something bright red, most of the time they're going to say, don't touch that. Very poisonous, because here you are in a sea of green, and all of a sudden this bright red plant, and it's not eaten and it's not gone and it's standing out. And so, of course, those would be the things that we would collect, because again, you think chemo drugs or cancer or something like that. So yes, that's the law of signatures in a nutshell.
And along with that, you described the rainforests and the jungles as all these plants are engaged in chemical warfare. What does that mean?
It is. So if you take a half an acre of land in central North America and you counted the number of woody plants, those plants are just, you would consider woody plants. You might have 20 to 30 different species of different types of woody plants. But if you take that same half acre of land in Western Amazonia, you're going to find over 300 different species. So if you think about, this half acre of land, all these species, now that's just the wood. Think about the insects, the animals, the trees, the bushes, the flowers, everything, every kind of life form you can imagine, the soil and the microbes, all of that's trying to survive on a half an acre of land. There's one thing you can absolutely bet on, and that's going to be competition. They're constantly fighting for water, for sunlight, for space, protection from the predators and so forth. And so a plant that is threatened, can't get up and just run away. So it has developed, in many instances, these chemicals that, when threatened, they will release these, and it basically protects them, and a lot of times will kill them. And so my favorite example has always been the rosy periwinkle. And the rosy periwinkle in its natural state is from Madagascar. Now, the rosy periwinkle is one of these plants. If it's threatened, it will release these compounds. Well, the great thing is researchers looked at that, and what they found was that it also inhibited certain forms of cancer. And so from the rosy periwinkle, we created the drugs vincristine and vinblastine. They're still used today. And one of them was instrumental in helping defeat or treat childhood leukemia. And so, you have these jungles, and people often say, well, why do you go back to a same area twice? Why not go to a new area and develop? And it's because, competition is nonstop. And the way a species survives is Darwin's survival of the fittest all over. They're going to mutate. They're going to change. Whatever makes them stronger. And so they're constantly getting stronger. And this is why we haven't been able to find a cure for the common cold. And so anyway, but these areas, this is why we have a huge amount of our antibiotics, things like that come from these areas, because these compounds are so great at fighting bacteria and fungi and viruses. And I've often said, I think it's wonderful what we're doing in a laboratory, but dadgummit, go back to nature, go in these areas and just start testing some of these plants for their effectiveness against the bacteria and the viruses.
Expedition Congo, arguably, I think, probably the most audacious and most dangerous expedition that you've gone on.
Yes.
Why the Congo?
Do you know, it's the second largest rainforest in the world. It has always been a dream of mine. It's so little explored in many areas. And so it was just this thought of going into undocumented area to see, the virgin forest. And I remember we were 3 or 4 days into the Congo, and one of the guides stopped, and through the translator, he said, breathe, just breathe, because you're now breathing air that no one has ever breathed before. And it was just that rawness of really, being the first into an area to see that. And we wanted to be able to capture that and share that with students. And I think it was just the whole idea of the pristine nature of that sacred place on earth.
Who went with you?
We had a team of 14. So my dear friend Tibby Esteban Barrera, who is from Ecuador, was our wilderness survival expert. And videographer, Will Weldon, who lives in Durham, was our sound guy, second videographer. And then we hired a logistics team that met us there in the Congo. And then we hired local trackers, porters, guides for the rest of our team. So a pretty strong team.
Amy, what was the plan, the objective for this expedition?
The plan, honestly, we thought we're going to go into this area. A huge part of this was all about the educational materials. We wanted to immerse students in things and areas where most likely none of them would experience in their lifetime. And to be able to take this journey with us and instill, ideally, more explorers, more science, biology, geology kind of drives in their lives. And so that was a huge part of doing that. And we thought we're going to go in, we're going to see hopefully new species of life that maybe as we get back and biologists and our other collaborators will be able to look at and say, wait a minute, that's something new. I've never seen that before. A lot of this, and then be able to get back and see really what other people who are a lot more knowledgeable and experienced than we are could see in other areas. But it basically what happened was nothing further from that. It was just the trip from hell. Yeah.
So let's talk about that endeavor. You make it up to the town that is the jumping off point. You're having to wait around a few days. Then you had a little encounter with the law, did you not?
We did.
What happened?
That was, we were flying the drones, which we had permits, everything to do. But it was in this area, they thought it was espionage. And so we're flying these drones, and all of a sudden armed military guys come up and basically direct us to the back of a flatbed truck where an armed guy stands guard, and we are taken off to this building that apparently was their jail for hours. They scream and yell at us, and with very limited translation. And we are, of course, terrified because you're in the middle of nowhere and this is going on, and you can't talk, you can't understand what's going on, and then they ask for our passports, which, as you know, is about the worst thing that can possibly happen, because without a passport you can't even cross into the next region, much less get back to the U.S. Embassy or anywhere else to get out of the country. And so this went on for hours, the yelling and the screaming. And finally, our logistics guides offered a bribe. Bribes are illegal in the country, but the bribe was accepted and we were released. And it escalated further because the bribe became an issue. And so it just so happened one of the people that we had met while we were waiting around those few days was a lady who spoke English, and she sort of became Tibby and Will and my, almost like a mother to us. And she took care of us and made sure we were eating and prepared food for us and so forth. And when she heard of our arrest, she made a call to her brother, who happened to be the ambassador to Russia and Ukraine. And he called the president of the country. And the president of the country came to our aid and immediately was supportive of what we were doing, was very apologetic for the way that we had been treated, and forced the return of any of the money. Of course, we were like, please keep the money for the village, use it for them, but the president's mandate was that it be returned. The interesting thing was that the very next day, 2 Black helicopters landed in this village, and the villagers had never seen helicopters before. The men got out of these helicopters and they remained in the village. They didn't talk to anyone. We never spoke to them. But what we were told was several days later, when we left to go into the jungle, the day that our SUVs loaded up and headed out, the helicopters headed out as well. And so it was a beautiful situation in a lot of ways, and but also very understandable why they might have thought that it was espionage. So anyway, that was the first of 5 arrests that we had, and 2 of them we were taken to jail. So that was the first one. Sort of makes you a little skittish to breathe when you are around anything like that.
That far from home.
Yes, yes.
You're finally ready. Tell us about going into that infamous jungle. What did you experience?
It was tough. We all were hacking with machetes, a lot of thorns, a lot of briars. So, constantly just ripping through your clothing and your flesh, and taking time. You think you're going to cover a certain amount of ground each day, and within an hour that just stopped, because it took 10 times the amount of time to go 20 yards, because you're hacking through all of this until you finally get to an area. And it's almost like old forest, gorgeous old trees. The canopy is absolutely spectacular. And inhibited us the most was from the very beginning, when we would stop for a break, and 15, 20-minute break just to sit or stand and drink water. All of a sudden, a few bees would come. First, the butterflies. Butterflies were amazing, because all of a sudden you'd look down and you'd have 5 on your shirt. And it was just like, you felt like you were in paradise. It was like a little piece of heaven. But then a few minutes later, bees would start to come. If you stayed there too long, before you knew it, bees were all over you. The most difficult time was in the middle of the day, around what I would guess probably was around 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Our indigenous friends would want to stop, make a fire, and cook food. Whereas we were like, plenty of power bars and things like that. And we're like, here, you can have our food, but they didn't want that. So respectfully, every day we waited for that. And at that point, you're sitting there for about an hour. And, as God is my witness, you would look down and there would be no less than 100 bees on one leg. And you're standing there, and you have 2 choices. One, you can stand there and allow these bees to keep accumulating, and they're flying underneath your glasses and in your ears and all over your face. And it's a psychological, battle that you're battling within yourself. Just be still. They're not stinging you, but these things are crawling all over your body. Or you can walk. And if you walk a little bit, you still have the bees around you, but they're not, I guess, as intense. But the thing is, if you're walking around a jungle without indigenous eyes. And I don't have those eyes. So, and your tracker, your guide can see that, there's a pit viper on a limb. But to me, I may miss it and it just looks like a limb, or it looks like a leaf and it's really, again, a pit viper or something. And so there would be a point where I would just say, crap, I'm going to walk. I'd rather take my chances. And then you get out there and then I think, this is stupid. I'm going to die. Bees just crawl all over me. But that became a huge ordeal with all of us, that even packing up camp or setting up camp, you're having to take machetes and cut the trees to be able to set up a tent on some uneven ground. And you're bending over and you're using your machete or you're setting up your tent. Well, inevitably, the bees are, getting caught in the crevice of your arm or in your back or in your knees. And so you're constantly getting stung. And then there were the ants. Ants were horrific, more so in the Congo than I've ever seen in any jungle or section of jungle in my entire life. And this one time we had made camp, we were exhausted. Really you just want to dive into your tent to have a reprieve from the bees and the insects. And I have to go pee. I mean, my bladder is about as full as it can be. And being the only female, the men have got it so lucky. They take 5 steps and just turn their back and it's no big deal. But I walk, a good 20 yards away from, this area where we're setting up the tents. And Mike, I squat and I pee as fast as I possibly can. And I'm walking back. And all of a sudden, I feel these bites all over the back of my back. They're on my torso. They're on my arms. And I just start slapping my body. And I call over to Will. I'm like, Will, come here quick. And he runs over and he's just pounding the back of my back. We find out there are these rather large ants that have mandibles. And in that short period of time, I was stupid. I had untucked my shirt when I got to camp because it was hot and I just wanted to have some ventilation. When I had, I guess, squatted down, the ants came up my leg and then crawled up underneath my shirt. And just in that time period, just all of a sudden it just welts all over. But other than the initial discomfort, it was no big deal. It wasn't like it made you sick or anything, but it became a psychological game of, oh my God, if it's not the bees, it's the ants. If it's not the ants. And then we kept getting lost because, you can't get, your GPS doesn't work. Your satellite phone doesn't work. There's no way to get through the canopy to get the signals. And our guides and our trackers were known to be some of the best in the area. But when there's no indication of where the sun is, you don't know if it's in front of you or behind you, so we kept getting lost. And in the process, we ran out of water. And it was a time where you really start to confront death. And every single one of us thought, we're not getting out of here. We could not find our way out of there. Even the trackers who had, you bend the branches to create a trail. When they lost that trail, the jungle's so thick, they could not find the trail for us to get back out of. And so finally, we're in the middle of the night and one of the guides finally finds one of the branches and are able to find the trail back out. And so, but it makes you grateful for GPS in your car these days.
Yeah, it was a near thing. You were days out there with just very little water.
Yeah, it hot and humid, but amazingly, you sort of get used to it. And it's not like a lot of our friends who are mountain climbers who are in the snow. I mean, I can't imagine anything more miserable than being cold and wet in an environment where you're stuck. And at least in the jungle, you can pretty much adapt to the humidity and the heat. Yeah.
As long as you have water.
Yes. Yes. As long as you have water. And that's something too, when you become dehydrated, you don't want to eat. You don't want to eat anything because then you feel like you need water. And I know on the last day and a half before we were able to come out, the guides had found, and I apologize, I should know the name of this vine, but I can't recall. And they turned it up, and we had a limited amount of fresh water. So everybody sort of had a few sips of that. There was a point where we decided to get on a trail which was made by forest elephants, just to get a break and having to hash through the jungle. There was one little section where there was a tiny bit of water pooled in the footprints of these elephants. And we all took turns taking a sip of that dirty water. And it was like, okay, I don't really give a crap if I get giardia or whatever. It just was that, human nature that, okay, there's water, I'm going to drink it no matter what. So it was an experience of questioning, priorities and teamwork and determination. Yeah, but something I pray that I don't have an experience like that ever again in my life.
You were leading the expedition. How did you keep everybody together?
Oh, I think one of the biggest things that I learned early on, and a dear friend of mine that I need to connect you with, Celine Cousteau, we used to talk a lot in the early days about things. And but one of the things is you never let any of the guides and porters and trackers see you panic. Now, Tibby and Will, the three of us, we would get together, and there were points when all three of us at different times broke down and cried. It was just the breaking point. I can't handle this anymore. We're going to die, blah, blah, blah. But we did that at a place where nobody else could see. And I think that there were moments that I was terrified that our trackers and our guides would say, the heck with this. We're not going to die. We're leaving, and take all of our stuff and leave us stranded out there. I think the thing is you have a mutual respect. You work together as a team. You honor every member of that team. So when one of their guides had a bee sting on his hand and his hand was swollen 5 times, the whole focus of the whole team is on that guy, period. I think that you instill a level of loyalty, if you will, for all team members at that point. And luckily, we didn't get a point that there were people who left for fear of their, getting back to their own families and stuff. But it's not always easy. And I think just this point of working with the expectations of us and our culture, working with what is norm in another culture. And it's not our way of life that they need to succumb to. We need to work with them. But at the same time, we've got to have understandings of how things happen. And there have been so many times that those understandings have been near to impossible, enough to compromise the whole expedition.
There was one particular fellow that would intrigue me on the Congo expedition, the blind healer. Tell us about him.
Wasn't he beautiful? Oh my gosh. I have been around a lot of healers and elders that had some difficulty seeing because of what we would probably label cataracts or macular degeneration, something that happens in age. But this particular healer, he was of the Baka tribe. So most people know that better as Pygmies, but they prefer being known as the Baka tribe. Dominique was blind since birth. We met him, spent several hours with him, had plans to go in the dugout upstream, upriver, up towards the Central African Republic at this point. And so we made an arrangement to come back and spend more time with him when we got back. And when we did, he had gone out into the jungle. What he did was he would go out with an assistant. He would know the plants that he needed. He would use his other senses. So the sense of smell, taste, touch. It was amazing because he would be able to, like what I referred to earlier, there are two trees, and to me, Mike, they look the same. But he would say, take from this one, but don't take from this one. And use this plant, but don't use that plant. And he had, again, was born blind. His father was a great healer, his father's father, his father's father's father, and so forth. And it was his birthright to become the healer. And so his father took all this time and led him by the hand into the forest and taught him how to find the medicines and to treat his village. It was by far one of the most beautiful experiences in my life. The beauty that he had when he talked about it, the knowledge that he had, it was just beautiful.
Final thoughts. I mean, you've been through a lot. We've kind of just touched on it, and I hope everyone gets a sense of understanding the harsh environments that you've been in order to seek out this information and these healers. What have these expeditions taught you?
Wow, the first thing that comes to mind is that, who was it? Was it Mark Twain that said, what you think you know, that just ain't so? The more you learn, the more you realize the things you don't know. And, a prime example just comes to mind was the drug Taxol that we dispensed a long time in the pharmacy, used for breast cancer and ovarian and other things. Well, the story goes back that in the Pacific Northwest, these loggers would go through and they would get to a patch of woods and they would cut down all of these trees, except when they got to the Pacific yew tree. And, it had no commercial value. And so what they would do was they would either cut it down and toss it to the side or just absolutely neglect the whole thing. Well, lo and behold, years later, researchers came through and they noticed that it was the bark of this tree killed cancer cells unlike anything that they'd ever seen. And so they went through, they isolated this compound, and actually here at Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, and they created this drug Taxol, which did wonders for breast cancer survivorship all over the world. Well, we dispensed this drug forever. And then they found out it wasn't really the bark of the tree where the compound was coming from. There was a microbe, like a tiny little organism that was on this bark. And together with the bark, they created this compound. And, I think that that's the way our world is. I think that we've made some amazing strides, but I think that we are missing a huge part of what life really is all about and the solutions to a lot of these problems that reside in nature in ways also that we're not looking at right now. I don't know what the answer is. I just want the world to sort of wake up and say, oh my God. And let's start talking to these cultures and let's take these treatments and let's use them exactly the way that they use them and see, okay, if those are the benefits that we need and those are the results we need to take that on a broader scale. But it involves the teamwork and, also honoring again and respecting a group of people that don't have the doctorates or the research or the degrees, even like myself, that are coming in from a completely different standpoint. And I think that when we can bridge these two worlds and we can utilize the strengths of every member of the team, I think that is the only time that we're going to have optimal healthcare and healing in our world.
When you say recognize these indigenous healers, well, I think we have to recognize that they may not have the 4, 6, 8, 10 years of university training, but they stand on the shoulders of generation after generation after generation of keen observers and, in their own way, scientists and medical professionals. And I think if we understand that hundreds of years went into their knowledge, maybe we'll respect them a bit more.
I agree. And I think about, the example I used with the healer that was, showing me every sign of a stroke. Mike, he not only knew what I did and we knew it on different names and compounds or whatever, different ways of looking at it, but he was even more brilliant because he had the cure. I understood what a stroke was, and I knew that we had pharmaceuticals for that. But it's like, oh, here it is. This is what's going on. And by the way, this is what we use to treat it. And it makes it all better again. And I thought, oh my God, but you're right on. And intelligence takes many forms, from book to intuitiveness and many different realms.
Well, Amy, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to highly recommend your book. It's entitled "And the Silent Spoke." Excellent work. Really enjoy reading it.
Thank you.
In addition to getting your book, how else can people follow your work?
Really, so much, right, with what I've done, with the studies and everything are pretty much, I'm going to be volunteering a lot of time and my expertise with just trying to help encourage other people and students and scientists. Well, that's a really great question. I still love all the things that I did and continue to do, but we're in a different world. And to be honest, a couple of hip replacements have sort of taken the toll on my right side of my body. So carrying those 45 and 50 pound packs are those days are pretty much over with right now.
Do you have a website or places that people can follow you online?
We do. Facebook, and the book And the Silent Spoke has a website. Our Healing Seekers, we dissolved. That was the educational. We dissolved that last year, but all of our educational videos are still available in several educational venues as well as YouTube, and they will be into perpetuity.
I'll have links to all those sites for those who I hope will follow you and learn and hopefully inspire others to pick up the challenge.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a joy. So thank you so very much. And I enjoy your program so much. I was listening to Wayne White, I think, earlier today. And
he's quite a character.
Yeah, I really like him. But I like all of your guests. And it's like one of those things that you really do wish you had a huge table and you could just sit there and listen all day long. So thank you for doing what you're doing, because you're bringing different worlds into my life.
All right. Thank you, Amy. We'll see you on down the road.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you down the road when we get together again, share a glass of whiskey, and hear more stories of adventure as told by those who live them. Until then, check us out at michaeljreinhart.com, where you'll find more of my work as an adventure photojournalist. Photos, videos, and articles of interesting people, mysterious places, and exotic cultures from the wild places of the world.